Yes, yes, people, it's 1% wiser. What are you saying? I've got an amazing video for you today. You guys need to watch it all the way through. Even if you go to sleep listening to it, you're still going to get the knowledge inside the brain. Mate, big up to the person who fucking made it. He probably made it with AI, and it's top notch, mate. It's top notch. I'm telling you, like, so some of the facts in it, I was like, what? Like, there's no way we'd lied in the UK. That we would lie to in the UK that much. But yeah, big up to Sleepy UK History. I'll put all the links in the description, and yeah, just watch the video. It's fucking sick, and I got 1% wiser from listening to it, so you know that. But yeah, hope you guys are blessed. Hope you have a good one, and yeah, nice little fucking 2-hour video for you.
Welcome. Find a comfortable position. Let your breathing slow and allow yourself to settle into the quiet of this moment. Tonight, we are going to travel gently through the long, winding story of British history, not to alarm or excite you, but simply to whisper a few truths that the textbook sometimes forgot to mention. Every one of these 99 stories is real, and each one is quietly remarkable in its own way. There is nothing to memorize, nothing to remember in the morning. Just let the words drift over you like the turning of old pages in a warm library, as we begin, very softly, at the very beginning. Lie number 1. The Romans built Hadrian's Wall to keep out the Scots. This is one of the first things many children are told when they learn about the Romans, and it sounds so tidy. A great wall stretching coast to coast, built to keep fearsome northern tribes at bay. But when you look more carefully, the picture becomes far more interesting. When Emperor Hadrian ordered the wall's construction around 122 AD, the people living north of it were not called Scots at all. The Scots, as we understand them, would not arrive until much later, migrating from Ireland several centuries down the line. The people north of the wall were mostly Pictish tribes. More importantly, historians now believe the wall was not purely a military barrier. It was more likely a frontier control system, a way of regulating trade, movement, and the flow of people across a deeply mixed border zone. People passed through its gates regularly. The wall marked the edge of Roman administrative power, but it was never simply a lock on a door. Lie number 2. Queen Boudica had fiery red hair and rode a chariot with spinning blades on its wheels. The image of Boudica is one of the most enduring in all of British history. The fierce warrior queen, her copper hair streaming behind her, standing tall in a war chariot as she led her people against the Roman invaders. But almost every detail of this picture comes not from fact, but from centuries of artistic reimagining. The Roman historian Cassius Dio did describe a tall woman with reddish hair, but he was writing more than 100 years after Boudica lived. The scythed chariot is almost certainly a later Romantic addition, with no reliable archaeological evidence to support it. The idealized vision of Boudica owes more to Victorian painters and sculptors than to anything the Romans actually recorded. What is genuinely documented is that she led a devastating uprising around 60 to 61 AD that destroyed the Roman settlements at Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium. That part of her story is extraordinary on its own. Lie number 3. King Alfred burned the cakes because he was careless and distracted. The story of King Alfred burning the cakes is one of the oldest and most beloved tales in English history. A king in disguise, sheltering with a peasant woman, too absorbed in thoughts of war to notice the cakes she had asked him to watch were burning. She scolds him, not knowing who he is, and he accepts the rebuke humbly. But the tale does not appear in any source written during Alfred's own lifetime. It surfaces in a text written roughly a century after his death, and its purpose was clearly moralizing rather than historical. Alfred the Great, who ruled Wessex in the 9th century, was one of the most genuinely accomplished rulers in early English history. He reorganized the military, promoted literacy and learning, personally translated Latin texts into Old English, and held back the Viking Great Army at a time when every other Anglo-Saxon kingdom had fallen. The tale of the burnt cakes, while endearing, has tended to obscure just how intellectually formidable this king actually was. Lie number 4. William the Conqueror had complete control of England immediately after Hastings in 1066. The Norman conquest is often taught as a clean, decisive moment. One battle, one victory, one new king, and everything changes overnight. The reality was considerably messier. After Hastings, William spent several weeks laying waste to the surrounding countryside, burning villages and crops, partly to force the English to submit through fear and hunger. Significant English resistance continued for years. The harrying of the North in 1069 and 1070 was a particularly savage campaign in which William's forces devastated much of northern England, destroying farmland on such a scale that the region took generations to recover. The transformation of English society was a gradual process unfolding over decades. William held his new kingdom together through extraordinary force and political skill, but it was never the smooth takeover that a simple timeline in a textbook might suggest. Lie number 5. Medieval people believed the earth was flat. This idea has proven remarkably stubborn, and it is almost entirely untrue. The educated people of medieval Europe, including monks, scholars, theologians, and university professors, were well aware that the earth was spherical. This was not a secret or revolutionary idea. It had been established by ancient Greek thinkers and was widely known throughout the medieval scholarly world. Medieval university curricula included works that discussed the Earth's roundness openly and matter-of-factly. The confusion likely arises from a 19th century invention. Writers, including Washington Irving, helped propagate the idea that Columbus bravely sailed against a flat Earth church. In reality, no educated person of Columbus's time thought the Earth was flat. The debate about his voyage concerned not the shape of the Earth, but the estimated distance to Asia. And on that point, his critics were actually correct. Lie number 6. The Black Death was caused entirely by rats. The story most of us learned goes like this. Plague-ridden fleas lived on rats. The rats travelled on ships, and the catastrophe began. This is partly true, but the full picture of how the Black Death spread so rapidly is considerably more complicated. Recent scientific research, including analysis of teeth and bones from mass burial sites, has suggested that pneumonic plague, which spreads through the air between people, may have played a much larger role than previously acknowledged. This would explain how the disease moved so quickly through communities where the rat population was not particularly unusual. The Black Death arrived in England in 1348 and killed perhaps a third to a half of the population over the following years, reshaping land ownership, labour relations, and the entire social structure of medieval English life. It deserves to be understood in its full complexity, rather than reduced to a simple story about ships and rodents. Lie number 7. Henry VIII broke with Rome because of his love for Anne Boleyn. The story of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn is irresistible. A king so besotted with a clever young woman that he tore apart the entire religious structure of his kingdom just to be with her. But the reasons behind the English Reformation are far more layered than a simple love story. Henry had been growing frustrated with papal authority long before Anne entered his life. The question of who held power over the English Church was bound up with questions of sovereignty, taxation, and political control that mattered intensely to Tudor monarchs. Anne was also far more theologically engaged than popular retellings suggest. She was genuinely interested in reform ideas and in making the scriptures available in English. After her execution in 1536, the Reformation Henry had initiated continued on its own trajectory, driven by political forces that had always been about much more than one impatient king and the woman he loved. Lie number 8. Anne Boleyn had 6 fingers on her right hand. The claim that Anne Boleyn possessed an extra finger is one of the most persistent myths in Tudor history. It appears in many accounts and has been repeated so often that it has taken on the texture of established fact. But the evidence for it is remarkably thin. The most specific source is a Catholic propagandist named Nicholas Sander, writing several decades after Anne's death, who described various physical abnormalities as part of a deliberate effort to discredit her memory. None of the contemporary descriptions of Anne mention any such thing. She was described as charming, witty, and graceful, a skilled dancer and musician. The 6-fingered story was almost certainly invented or embellished after her fall from power, when there was considerable political motivation to portray her as an unnatural figure. The true Anne Boleyn is a genuinely fascinating historical person who does not require invented oddities to make her story worth telling. Lie number 9. Richard III was a physically deformed villain who murdered his nephews. Richard III has suffered perhaps more than any other English monarch from the power of a single writer's imagination. Shakespeare's portrayal of him as a twisted, scheming monster served the political purposes of the Tudor dynasty that had overthrown Richard, and it has coloured perceptions of the man ever since. The discovery of Richard's skeleton beneath a Leicester car park in 2012 told a more nuanced story. He did have significant scoliosis, but this would not necessarily have produced the grotesque deformity Shakespeare described, and there was no evidence of a withered arm. As for the murder of his nephews, the truth is simply that we do not know what happened to them. They disappeared from the tower during Richard's reign, and their fate has never been conclusively established. Richard III was a complex historical figure who governed effectively for years. He deserves a more thoughtful assessment than Shakespeare's dramatic convenience allowed. Lie number 10. England won a total and complete victory over the Spanish Armada. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 is one of the most celebrated moments in English history, and it genuinely was a significant event. But the version taught in many classrooms is a considerable oversimplification. The English Navy did play a role. The use of fireships at Gravelines disrupted the Spanish formation, and the subsequent engagement caused some damage. But the weather did most of the real destruction. As the Armada retreated northward around Scotland and down the western coast of Ireland, violent storms wrecked dozens of ships, and thousands of Spanish sailors drowned or were killed. England did not really destroy the Armada so much as survive it, while the North Atlantic did its own work. Spain launched 2 further armadas against England in 1596 and 1597. Both were also scattered by storms. Spain remained a powerful force for decades afterward, and the Anglo-Spanish War continued until 1604. Lie number 11. Sir Francis Drake calmly finished his game of bowls before fighting the Spanish Armada. The image of Francis Drake standing on Plymouth Hoe, leisurely completing his game of bowls while Spanish sails appeared on the horizon, has become one of the defining pictures of English composure. The story first appears in print in the 17th century, long after Drake's death in 1596, and there is no contemporary record to support it. More practically, the English fleet was in Plymouth Harbour, and the tide would not have allowed the ships to leave safely until it turned. If Drake was playing bowls, he was almost certainly waiting for the tide, and any story of a heroic calm may simply have been a later embellishment added to explain the delay. Drake was genuinely courageous and highly capable, the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe, a skilled and feared naval commander. He does not need a mythological game of bowls to make his story interesting. Lie number 12. Elizabeth I was the Virgin Queen purely by personal choice and religious conviction. Elizabeth I cultivated the image of the Virgin Queen deliberately and skillfully throughout her reign. But historians have long debated what actually lay behind her famous reluctance to marry, and the answers are considerably more complicated than simple piety. Marriage, for Elizabeth, was a deeply dangerous proposition. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had been executed. Her stepmother, Catherine Howard, had been executed. To marry a foreign prince would risk subjugating English interests to another power. To marry an English nobleman would elevate one family above all others and create faction and instability. And to produce a child in an era of high maternal mortality meant risking her life and the stability of her realm simultaneously. The decision never to marry may have been partly a calculated political strategy and partly the result of circumstances that made every available option seem more dangerous than the alternative of remaining single. Number 13. Guy Fawkes was the mastermind of the gunpowder plot. Every 5th of November, effigies of Guy Fawkes are burned across England, and his name has become so synonymous with the gunpowder plot of 1605 that many people assume he was its organizer. He was not. The actual architect of the plot was Robert Catesby, a deeply religious Catholic gentleman, radicalized by the persecution of Catholics under Elizabeth I. Catesby recruited a small group of conspirators, and Fawkes was brought in specifically for his military expertise and experience handling explosives, skills developed fighting for Spain in the Low Countries. Fawkes was given the task of guarding the gunpowder stored beneath the Houses of Parliament, and it was there that he was discovered and arrested. Catesby was killed resisting arrest, which may partly explain why history attached Fawkes's name so firmly to the plot. The annual bonfire night tradition has since been reclaimed in modern times as a symbol of resistance to authority rather than the religious extremism it originally represented. Lie number 14. The Great Fire of London was caused deliberately as part of a Catholic conspiracy. In the immediate aftermath of the Great Fire of London in September 1666, a French Catholic watchmaker named Robert Hubert confessed to starting the fire deliberately. He was tried, convicted, and hanged. The problem was that his confession was almost certainly false, and several people pointed this out at the time. Hubert had not even arrived in London until after the fire began. Despite all of this, the atmosphere of anti-Catholic hysteria in Restoration London meant his execution proceeded anyway. The real cause of the fire was almost certainly accidental. Thomas Fariner, the King's baker in Pudding Lane, very probably failed to properly extinguish his ovens on the night of the 2nd of September. The monument erected to commemorate the fire originally bore an inscription blaming Catholic arsonists, and that inscription was not removed until 1830, more than a century and a half after the event. Lie number 15. Isaac Newton discovered gravity when an apple fell on his head. Newton himself, late in his life, did tell a version of this story involving an apple falling in his mother's garden, where he had retreated during the Cambridge plague years of 1665 and 1666. However, the story as usually told implies that the apple hit him on the head, and he immediately understood the entire theory of gravity. Neither part is accurate. The apple, in Newton's own account, simply fell nearby and prompted him to think about the nature of the force pulling objects toward the Earth. The full development of his theory of universal gravitation was the work of many years and required extraordinary mathematical innovation, most famously the development of calculus. What Newton achieved was a precise mathematical description of how gravity worked across vast distances, unifying the motion of apples and moons and planets into a single elegant framework. That achievement took years of sustained, brilliant intellectual effort, not a single afternoon under a tree. Lie number 16. Robin Hood was a real historical person who lived in Sherwood Forest. Despite numerous attempts over the centuries to identify a historical Robin Hood, no convincing candidate has ever been found. The earliest Robin Hood ballads, which date from the 13th and 14th centuries, describe a yeoman, not the dispossessed earl he later becomes in Tudor retellings. These early stories are set in Barnsdale in Yorkshire as often as in Sherwood Forest in Nottinghamshire. The name Robin Hood appears in several medieval legal records, but it seems to have been used as a generic term for an outlaw, much as we might use a fictional name as a type. Several real individuals named Robert Hood have been proposed as the original, but none of the evidence has proven convincing to historians. What Robin Hood represents, the idea of just resistance against corrupt authority, the protection of the poor against the powerful, seems to have been a recurring need in medieval English society, and the legend grew to fill that need rather than growing from any single historical root. Lie number 17. King Canute arrogantly commanded the waves, thinking he could control them. The story of King Canute ordering the tide to turn back is usually told as a story of royal arrogance. But this is precisely the wrong way around. The medieval chronicler, Henry of Huntingdon, who first recorded the story in the 12th century, told it as a lesson in royal humility, not arrogance. In his account, Canute placed his throne at the water's edge and commanded the tide precisely in order to demonstrate to his flattering courtiers that he was not all-powerful. When the tide came in and wet his robes, he reportedly said that no king deserved to be called great except God. The morale was explicitly the opposite of the one the story usually carries. Canute was a Danish king who ruled England, Denmark, and Norway simultaneously and governed England with considerable effectiveness. The tide story was designed to present him as a wise ruler who understood the limits of earthly power, not a vain fool who thought himself divine. Lie number 18. The Crusades were a noble religious mission to liberate the Holy Land. The Crusades, which began with the call of Pope Urban II in 1095 and continued for nearly 2 centuries, are a subject of ongoing historical debate. In older British history teaching, they were often presented as a fundamentally noble enterprise. The reality was more complicated and often more troubling. The Crusades were motivated by a mixture of genuine religious faith, papal politics, the desire for land and wealth by younger sons who stood to inherit nothing, and the complex pressures of a feudal society finding outlets for its restless warrior class. The massacre of Jewish communities in the Rhineland before the First Crusade even left Europe is one of the darker early chapters. When Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders in 1099, the slaughter of its Muslim and Jewish inhabitants was recorded by contemporaries on both sides in deeply disturbing terms. The legacy of the Crusades in the history of Christian-Muslim relations deserves careful and honest engagement rather than simple, heroic framing. Lie number 19. The Magna Carta was a founding document of democracy that gave rights to ordinary people. The Magna Carta, sealed by King John at Runnymede in June 1215, holds an almost sacred place in the story of English liberty. But the document the barons forced upon John was not a declaration of universal rights. It was, at its core, a feudal agreement designed primarily to protect the specific privileges and property rights of the noble class. Most of its 63 clauses deal with highly technical matters of feudal law. The famous clause promising no free man shall be imprisoned except by lawful judgment was significant. But the free men it referred to were an elite minority in a society where most people were unfree peasants. John never intended to honour the charter and sought to have it annulled within weeks. It was only through later reissues, gradually reinterpreted over centuries, that Magna Carta acquired its broader symbolic status as a foundation of constitutional government. Its importance grew more from the use later generations made of it than from its original content. Lie number 20. The Vikings were merely savage raiders who destroyed everything they touched. The word Viking conjures an image of horned helmeted warriors leaping from longships to burn monasteries. The raids were real, and they were violent and devastating for the communities that experienced them. But reducing the entire Viking world to raiding is like describing the history of Britain solely through its episodes of imperial violence. The people we call Vikings were also remarkable traders, explorers, craftsmen, and town builders. They established the city of Dublin and several other significant urban centres in Ireland. They founded the state of Normandy in northern France. They reached Iceland, Greenland, and the coast of North America centuries before Columbus. Their trade networks stretched from Newfoundland to Byzantium and Central Asia. Many common English words, including sky, window, knife, husband, and egg, come from Old Norse. The Vikings who settled in England integrated into existing society over generations, and their cultural legacy is woven into the fabric of English life in ways still visible today. Lie number 21. Shakespeare invented the English language. Shakespeare is one of the greatest writers in the history of the English language, and his contribution to its literature is genuinely extraordinary. He coined many words and phrases that have passed into common use, but the idea that he invented the English language is a considerable overstatement. The English language was already rich and complex long before Shakespeare was born in 1564. Chaucer was writing in English in the 14th century. The Bible translations of William Tyndale in the 16th century shaped English prose profoundly. The works of medieval mystery plays and the entire tradition of English poetry before the Elizabethan era all contributed to the language Shakespeare inherited and transformed. What he did do was use it with unmatched versatility, psychological depth, and poetic power in ways that have influenced how writers express themselves for 4 centuries. That is achievement enough without the additional myth of being the language's inventor. Lie number 22. Walter Raleigh introduced potatoes and tobacco to England. Sir Walter Raleigh is often credited in school lessons with introducing 2 of history's most consequential imports to English shores, the potato and tobacco. The tobacco story has some basis, in fact. Raleigh did popularize pipe smoking at the Elizabethan court, but he did not discover tobacco or bring it to Europe for the first time. Spanish explorers had been importing tobacco decades before Raleigh's involvement. As for the potato, the evidence that Raleigh introduced it to England is thin at best. Potatoes arrived in Europe via Spain from South America in the 1560s, and there were several possible routes by which they reached the British Isles that had nothing to do with Raleigh. The persistence of both stories reflects the way in which Raleigh, a genuinely colourful Elizabethan figure, became a catchment for various myths of English exploration and enterprise. He was a poet, a courtier, a privateer, and an explorer, but his significance does not rest on introducing condiments and smoking to the English. Lie number 23. Oliver Cromwell banned Christmas in England. Few historical myths are more cheerfully repeated than the one about Oliver Cromwell cancelling Christmas. The image of grey-coated Puritans confiscating Christmas puddings is almost comic in its grimness. The reality is somewhat more complicated. It is true that the Long Parliament passed an ordinance in 1647 abolishing the feast days of Christmas, Easter, and Whitsun. However, it was Parliament that passed these laws, not Cromwell personally, and the enforcement of these rules was inconsistent, contested, and genuinely unpopular. There were riots in several towns when authorities tried to close markets on Christmas Day, and many people continued to celebrate quietly at home. When Charles II was restored to the throne in 1660, traditional Christmas festivities returned relatively quickly. The period of Puritan Christmas suppression was real but relatively brief, and it was never quite the totalitarian festival cancellation that the popular story suggests. Lie number 24. The Pilgrim Fathers, who sailed to America on the Mayflower, were fleeing religious persecution in England. The separatists, who eventually sailed on the Mayflower in 1620, were indeed religious dissenters who faced genuine difficulties in Jacobean England. But the picture is more complicated than a simple narrative of persecution and escape. The group had actually left England for the Netherlands more than a decade earlier, settling in Leiden in 1608. They were not immediately fleeing the flames of martyrdom. The reasons they eventually chose to cross the Atlantic were mixed. There was concern that their children were assimilating too readily into Dutch culture and losing their English identity. There were economic difficulties. The journey was also undertaken with investment from London, merchants who expected a return on their money. The story of pure religious heroism is partly a creation of later American myth-making that served particular purposes in constructing a national founding narrative. Lie number 25. Mary I was simply a cruel religious fanatic who burned Protestants for sport. Mary I, the first Queen, regnant of England, has been given one of history's most damaging nicknames. Bloody Mary, a label attached to her after her death, has shaped perceptions of her reign so powerfully that many people know almost nothing else about her. The burning of nearly 300 Protestants during her 5-year reign was a real and terrible thing. But the use of execution for heresy was not unusual by the standards of 16th century European governance. Her father Henry VIII executed people for religious reasons throughout his reign. Mary was also, in many respects, a capable ruler who genuinely believed she was saving the souls of her subjects by bringing England back to the Catholic faith. She died without an heir, and her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth reversed her religious settlement, which meant her reputation was shaped almost entirely by those who had reason to vilify her. Lie number 26. The East India Company was simply a trading company. When British children learn about the East India Company, it is often presented as a commercial enterprise that happened to acquire some territory along the way, a company of merchants drawn into political matters through a series of unfortunate accidents. This dramatically understates what the company actually was. At its peak, the company administered a vast territory across the Indian subcontinent with its own private army numbering in the hundreds of thousands, its own civil service, its own courts, and its own foreign policy. It fought wars, overthrew rulers, and extracted enormous wealth through taxation and trade monopolies. The 1757 Battle of Plassey, in which Robert Clive defeated the Nawab of Bengal through military force and strategic bribery, began a process of British dominance over Bengal that involved the extraction of wealth on a scale that is staggering to contemplate. The company was a vehicle for state-sponsored extraction and conquest that operated with the backing of the British government while conveniently allowing that government to distance itself from its more violent activities. Lie number 27. Britain abolished the slave trade because of William Wilberforce alone. William Wilberforce is one of the most celebrated figures in British history, and his role in the campaign that led to the Slave Trade Act of 1807 was real and significant. But the story of British abolition, told through Wilberforce alone, leaves out a great deal. The campaign was the work of many people over many decades. Olaudah Equiano, a formerly enslaved African man who settled in Britain, published his autobiography in 1789 and became a powerful voice in the abolitionist movement. Quakers had been campaigning against the slave trade since the 1780s and organised some of the earliest effective petitioning campaigns in British political life. Women collected signatures in extraordinary numbers, and the resistance of enslaved people themselves played a crucial role in making the slave system unsustainable. The 1807 Act abolished the trade, but not slavery itself. When slavery was finally abolished in 1833, the government paid £20 million in compensation. That compensation went to slave owners, not to the people who had been enslaved. Lie number 28. The Irish famine was purely a natural disaster. The Great Famine that devastated Ireland between 1845 and 1852 killed approximately 1 million people and caused another million, or more, to emigrate in desperate circumstances. The immediate cause was the failure of the potato crop. But to describe it as purely a natural disaster is to ignore the policy decisions that shaped who died and in what numbers. Throughout the famine years, food continued to be exported from Ireland to Britain. The British government's response, shaped by a free market ideology that regarded intervention in food markets as economically harmful, was fatally slow and insufficient. Landlords continued to evict tenants who could not pay rent. The poor law system was modified in ways that placed the burden of relief on the Irish poor themselves. The argument that this was simply bad weather and bad luck, with no human responsibility attached, has been largely abandoned by serious scholarship. Lie number 29. The Opium Wars were fought in defense of free trade principles. The two Opium Wars, fought between Britain and China in 1839 to 1842 and 1856 to 1860, have sometimes been described as conflicts over the principle of free trade. This framing is not entirely false, but it requires some examination. The specific trade that Britain was defending was the export of opium, grown in British India and sold into China. The Chinese government had banned the opium trade because it was causing a devastating public health crisis and draining silver from the Chinese economy. When Commissioner Lin Zexu destroyed 20,000 chests of opium in 1839, the British response was military force. The wars resulted in China being forced to cede Hong Kong, open treaty ports, and pay enormous indemnities. The language of free trade served as a justification for what was, in effect, enforced drug trafficking backed by gunboats. Lie number 30. Florence Nightingale single-handedly revolutionized nursing during the Crimean War. Florence Nightingale did something genuinely remarkable in travelling to the military hospital at Scutari during the Crimean War in 1854, and her subsequent work in reforming hospital sanitation and the statistical analysis of healthcare outcomes was genuinely significant. But much of her most important work was done through data, through the meticulous collection and presentation of mortality statistics showing that soldiers were dying not from wounds, but from preventable diseases caused by poor sanitation. Alongside her at Scutari, and largely written out of subsequent history, was Mary Seacole, a Jamaican-Scottish woman who travelled to the Crimea at her own expense after being rejected for Nightingale's party, and who set up the British Hotel near the battlefield where she provided food, care, and nursing to wounded soldiers of all nationalities. Seacole's story was largely forgotten for over a century and has only been significantly recovered in recent decades. Lie number 31. The charge of the Light Brigade was a heroic and glorious victory. The charge of the Light Brigade at the Battle of Balaclava in October 1854 is one of the most famous episodes in British military history, and Tennyson's poem, immortalizing it, has fixed the image of 600 horsemen thundering toward the Russian guns in the collective imagination. But the charge was not a victory. It was, by any military analysis, a catastrophic blunder caused by a failure of communication and command. The brigade was ordered to charge a fortified Russian artillery battery through a valley covered by guns on three sides. Of approximately 670 men who rode in, over 100 were killed and nearly 200 wounded or taken prisoner. The Russian commander watching reportedly said that it was magnificent, but it was not war. Tennyson's poem, written within weeks of the event, shaped public perception in ways that have never entirely worn off. Lie number 32. Queen Victoria was a beloved maternal figure who gently guided her empire. The image of Queen Victoria as a kind of universal grandmother, a comfortable symbol of imperial family values, who gently presided over a prosperous and righteous empire, is a profoundly reassuring one. But it requires considerable qualification. Victoria was not consistently warm or kind, even to her own children, several of whom found her demanding, critical, and emotionally withholding. Her prolonged withdrawal from public life after Prince Albert's death in 1861 prompted genuine public frustration and even Republican sentiment. The empire over which she presided was built and maintained through violence on a scale that was often brutal. The famines in India during her reign killed millions in a context of British policies that prioritized grain exports over famine relief. The concentration camps of the Second Boer War, in which tens of thousands of Boer civilians died of disease and malnutrition, were established while Victoria was still on the throne. The full picture of the Victorian Empire is vastly more complicated than the domestic image of an elderly queen surrounded by grandchildren. Lie number 33. Lawrence of Arabia liberated the Arab peoples. T.E. Lawrence is one of the most romantic figures in British imperial history. The image of a fair-haired English officer riding with Bedouin warriors across the desert has an almost cinematic quality. But the story of what Lawrence and the British government actually promised and delivered to the Arab peoples they encouraged to rise in revolt is considerably less heroic. Lawrence knew that the British government had made conflicting promises about the future of the Arab territories. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, negotiated in secret while the Arab revolt was underway, divided the Middle East into spheres of British and French influence, directly contradicting the promises of independence that had been made to Arab leaders. After the war, France took control of Syria and Lebanon. Britain took Palestine and Iraq. The Arabs who had fought alongside Lawrence found themselves living under new imperial masters rather than the independent states they had been promised. Lie number 34. World War I was caused by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on the 28th of June 1914 set the formal machinery of war in motion, and it appears in virtually every account of the war's origins. But to say the war was caused by this assassination is like saying a fire was caused by the match that lit it, without asking why the room was full of dry timber and spilled petrol. European powers had been building up their armies and navies for decades. Germany's naval expansion had created deep anxiety in Britain. The alliance system meant any conflict between two powers risked drawing in all the others. Elaborate military plans had been developed on the assumption that war was coming. The assassination was the trigger. But historians have debated for over a century the structural forces, from militarism to imperial competition to the rigidity of mobilization plans that made a local crisis expand into a world war in the space of 6 weeks. Lie number 35. Britain entered World War I purely to defend the neutrality of Belgium. When Britain declared war on Germany on the 4th of August, 1914, the official justification was Germany's violation of Belgian neutrality. The defense of Belgium was a genuine legal and moral argument, and it was the publicly stated reason for British entry. But historians have long observed that it was not the only reason. Britain had significant strategic interests in preventing any single continental power from dominating Europe, particularly France and the Channel ports. There was also the commitment made in secret staff talks between British and French military planners since 1906, in which British officers had been discussing the dispatch of an expeditionary force to France in the event of a German attack. These talks were unknown to most of the cabinet. The Belgian argument provided a morally compelling justification for a decision that had deeper strategic roots, and it helped bring a divided cabinet along with the government's decision for war. Lie number 36. The Christmas Truce of 1914 was a widespread and long-lasting event. The Christmas Truce of 1914, in which British and German soldiers climbed out of their trenches on Christmas Day, met in no man's land, exchanged gifts, and reportedly played football, is one of the most moving stories to emerge from the entire First World War. And it genuinely happened. Numerous letters and diaries from soldiers on both sides describe spontaneous ceasefires with remarkable consistency. But the popular version sometimes implies that the truce was widespread across the entire Western Front, which is not quite accurate. It was concentrated primarily in certain sectors, particularly those held by British and Saxon German units. In many other sectors, there was no truce at all, and the fighting continued normally. Senior commanders on both sides were displeased by the episode and took steps to ensure it would not be repeated. There were smaller, isolated Christmas ceasefires in subsequent years, but nothing on the scale of 1914. Lie number 37. Dunkirk was a great military victory. The evacuation at Dunkirk between the 26th of May and the 4th of June, 1940, in which over 300,000 Allied soldiers were lifted from the beaches of northern France, is one of the most extraordinary stories of World War II. Winston Churchill's speech about fighting on the beaches helped establish Dunkirk as a moment of national defiance that has never faded from British imagination. But Churchill himself, in the same speech, was careful to note that wars are not won by evacuations. Dunkirk was a military catastrophe that resulted in the loss of vast quantities of equipment and in the German occupation of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The fact that the British Expeditionary Force was rescued rather than captured was a remarkable stroke of fortune and an operational achievement of real significance. But the transformation of Dunkirk from a defeat into a kind of spiritual victory is an understandable piece of national mythology that should not obscure the stark military reality of what had happened in France in the spring of 1940. Lie number 38. The Battle of Britain was won purely by the few. Churchill's famous tribute to the Royal Air Force pilots who fought in the summer of 1940 gave the Battle of Britain a particular emotional shape. The image of young pilots scrambling from airfields to intercept German bombers is genuinely powerful, and the courage involved was real. But the battle was not won by fighter pilots alone. The ground crews who serviced and repaired aircraft, working around the clock, were essential. The radar system, chain home, was a decisive technical advantage that gave fighter command warning of incoming raids. The women of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force worked in operations rooms plotting aircraft movements, and the fighter pilots themselves came from many countries, with Polish, Czech, New Zealand, Canadian, Australian, and other pilots making up a significant proportion. The Poles, driven by ferocious motivation, having already fought in France, had an outstanding record. The victory belonged to far more than a few. Lie number 39. Britain stood completely alone against Hitler in 1940. The idea that Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany in 1940, defiant and isolated, contains real emotional truth. After the fall of France, Britain was the last major power actively fighting Germany on the European Western Front. But alone is not quite accurate. The British Empire was a functioning political and military reality, drawing soldiers, sailors, and airmen from across the world. Australian, New Zealand, Canadian, South African, and Indian troops were either already in service or being mobilized. The pilots from Poland and Czechoslovakia, who had escaped after the fall of their countries, flew in the Battle of Britain and were among its most effective combatants. The United States, while not yet in the war, was increasingly aligned with Britain through Lend-Lease, naval cooperation, and intelligence sharing. The image of a lone island defying the continent is compelling and served important purposes in sustaining morale, but it should not entirely obscure the global empire and increasingly sympathetic superpower allies standing behind it. Line number 40. The Blitz brought the British people together in perfect harmony. The bombing of British cities from September 1940 onward produced in its aftermath one of the most durable images in modern British history, the spirit of the Blitz, a nation united in cheerful defiance. This image was partly a creation of wartime propaganda, and it has been sustained by a powerful tradition of popular memory. But social historians examining the contemporary record have found a considerably more complicated picture. There were real instances of community solidarity and extraordinary courage. But there was also panic, looting of bombed properties, crime, and significant class tension around access to shelters. The wealthy retreated to reinforced private shelters not available to working-class Londoners sleeping in wet and overcrowded tube tunnels. Surveys conducted at the time found widespread defeatism and anger, as well as the solidarity celebrated by official reports. The full truth of the Blitz was that it produced a human spectrum of responses, from heroic to venal, because human beings always do. Lie number 41. Churchill's wartime speeches were broadcast live on radio as he delivered them to Parliament. The recordings of Winston Churchill's wartime speeches are among the most famous audio recordings in history. But the history of those recordings is more complicated than it appears. Most of Churchill's major parliamentary speeches were not broadcast live. Radio broadcasts of parliamentary proceedings were not permitted at the time. Churchill sometimes delivered shorter, specially prepared radio addresses, but several of his most famous speeches, including "We Shall Fight on the Beaches," were delivered in the House of Commons and only heard by the general public second-hand, through newspaper reports and later summaries. More intriguingly, the recordings most widely known today were made after the war. Churchill re-recorded several of his famous speeches in the early 1950s for posterity and commercial release. For decades, these post-war recordings were played as though they were contemporaneous, and the distinction was not widely known or discussed. Lie number 42. The British welfare state was created without significant political opposition. The creation of the National Health Service and the broader welfare state following the Labour landslide of 1945 is frequently presented as a moment of national consensus. The principle of universal healthcare free at the point of use did command wide support, but the actual creation of the NHS in 1948 was not smooth or unopposed. The medical profession, particularly the British Medical Association, was fiercely resistant to the new system. Doctors worried about losing their professional independence and their income. The BMA conducted polls of its members and found overwhelming opposition to Aneurin Bevan's proposals. Bevan ultimately overcame this resistance partly through genuine persuasion and partly, as he famously put it, by stuffing the doctors' mouths with gold, meaning a fee-per-service arrangement that allowed private practice to continue alongside NHS work. The compromise was significant and shaped the NHS in ways that are still felt today. Lie number 43. Rationing during World War II was fair and equal for everyone. Rationing was introduced in Britain in January 1940 and is often celebrated as having guaranteed everyone access to basic foodstuffs. The system was more equitable than distribution by price alone, and there is evidence that the nutritional status of the poorest sections of society actually improved during the war years. But it was not perfectly equal. Those with money could still eat well in restaurants, which were not subject to the same restrictions as domestic households. The wealthy could afford to spend their entire ration allocation on the best available food. Black market trading was widespread and almost entirely available only to those with disposable income. The experience of wartime hardship was also shaped by geography and class, in ways that the image of universal shared sacrifice tends to smooth over. Access to safe housing, private transport, and social connections all varied enormously by social position throughout the war. Lie number 44. The British Empire was a civilizing mission that brought progress to the world. The idea that the British Empire brought civilization, progress, and the rule of law to peoples who lacked these things was, for many educated British people, throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, a sincere and deeply held conviction. The railways built in India, the legal codes established across the empire, the schools founded by missionaries were presented as evidence of benevolent intent. But the historical account of what empire actually meant for the people living under it is far more complicated and far more troubling. The extraction of wealth from colonies on a scale that would have funded their development many times over. The destruction or suppression of existing legal and cultural systems. The famines that killed millions in India while grain was exported. The violently suppressed rebellions in Jamaica, Kenya, India, and elsewhere. The civilizing mission narrative was not cynically invented by people who knew it was false, but its persistence has made it difficult to have an honest conversation about what empire actually was. Lie number 45. Winston Churchill was universally loved by the British public during World War II. Churchill's reputation as the greatest Briton has tended to project backward a level of universal admiration that did not quite exist even during his finest hours. He was, without question, a remarkable wartime leader whose ability to communicate resolve in desperate circumstances was genuinely extraordinary. But the Churchill of 1940 to 1945 was also a controversial and sometimes deeply unpopular figure. Trade unions remained suspicious of him. His record at Gallipoli in 1915 was not forgotten. The general election of July 1945, held immediately after VE Day, produced one of the most striking results in British political history. The country that had just won the war under Churchill's leadership voted him out of office by a very large margin, electing a Labour government with a majority of 145 seats. His image as a timeless national hero was substantially a construction of the post-war decades. Lie number 46. Britain invented football, and the world should feel grateful. British people are sometimes heard to observe with a mixture of pride and exasperation that they invented football and yet rarely win the World Cup. The Football Association, founded in 1863, did codify the rules of association football in a form that became the basis for the modern game. But the idea that football was a British creation, rather than a codification of folk games that had existed across cultures for centuries, is considerably less solid. Ball games involving kicking a round object have been documented in China, Japan, ancient Greece, and Rome. The various folk football games played in medieval England and Scotland were often violent, loosely organised affairs. What Victorian England did was provide the institutional infrastructure, the clubs, the leagues, the international spread through naval officers and merchants and missionaries that carried association football around the world. That is worth acknowledging, but the claim to pure invention is rather stronger than the historical record quite supports. Lie number 47. The swinging 60s liberated everybody equally. The 1960s in Britain were genuinely a period of rapid social change. The partial decriminalisation of homosexuality in 1967, the Abortion Act, and the general cultural atmosphere of loosening social convention all represented real shifts in the possibilities available to many people. But the swinging 60s as a cultural phenomenon was concentrated primarily in London and was accessible primarily to white, middle-class young people with money. For millions in the British regions, in industrial towns and rural communities, many of the freedoms associated with the decade arrived much later, or not at all. For Caribbean and South Asian communities who had arrived in Britain during the post-war decades, the 60s were also the decade of Enoch Powell and significant racial discrimination in housing and employment. The decade that produced the Beatles and miniskirts also produced rivers of blood speeches. Both parts of that history belong in any honest account of the period. Lie number 48. Margaret Thatcher single-handedly destroyed the British coal industry. The miners' strike of 1984 to 1985 and the subsequent decline of the British coal industry under Margaret Thatcher's government is one of the most contested episodes in recent British political history. Thatcher's government did make a deliberate political decision to confront the National Union of Mine Workers and to pursue the closure of what it described as uneconomic pits. But the coal industry had been declining since at least the 1950s, and previous governments, both Labour and Conservative, had also overseen pit closures. What Thatcher's government did distinctively was refuse any kind of managed industrial transition that might have cushioned the impact on the communities that depended on the pits, and pursue the confrontation with the unions in a way that was partly ideological rather than purely economic. The consequences for those communities in terms of long-term unemployment, poverty, and health inequality were severe and have not fully resolved decades later. Lie number 49. The Norman Conquest completely destroyed Anglo-Saxon culture. The Norman Conquest is sometimes taught as a cultural extinction event, the moment when an older native English culture was swept away. The changes were real and significant. The English language was profoundly altered. The Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was almost entirely replaced. Architecture changed dramatically. But Anglo-Saxon culture did not simply disappear. The English language survived and over the following centuries reasserted itself strongly, eventually absorbing French vocabulary into a hybrid tongue that became Middle English and then Modern English. Anglo-Saxon legal traditions and local administrative structures survived in modified form. The ordinary people of England, the peasants and craftsmen and local clergy who made up the vast majority of the population, did not become Norman overnight. Their culture mixed with and was modified by Norman influence over generations, producing something new that was neither purely Anglo-Saxon nor purely Norman, but distinctively English. Lie number 50. The partition of India was inevitable and handled as well as it could have been. Indian independence and the partition of the subcontinent into India and Pakistan in August 1947 resulted in one of the largest and most violent mass migrations in human history. Somewhere between 10 and 20 million people were displaced. The death toll from communal violence is estimated at between 200,000 and 2 million people. The argument that partition was simply inevitable has been significantly challenged by research into specific policy decisions made in the final months of British rule. The decision to advance the date of independence from June 1948 to August 1947 gave far less time for orderly transition. The drawing of the partition boundary was entrusted to a barrister named Cyril Radcliffe, who had never visited India and was given 5 weeks to divide the subcontinent. His boundary award was announced only after the formal independence ceremonies, meaning millions of people became minorities in countries they were already on the wrong side of before anyone told them to move. These were choices, not inevitabilities. Lie number 51. The Mau Mau uprising in Kenya was simply a terrorist campaign. The Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, which began in the early 1950s and lasted until the early 1960s, was for many decades described in British accounts primarily as a violent and atavistic campaign of terror. The Mau Mau fighters were portrayed as primitive and brutal, and the violence that occurred was used to define the entire episode. But the uprising was rooted in genuine and long-standing grievances about land seizure, forced labour, and the broader injustices of British colonial rule in Kenya. The British response involved a systematic and well-documented programme of detention, torture, and violence against the Kikuyu population carried out on a very large scale. Documents about this programme were for decades suppressed or destroyed. Historian Caroline Elkins, whose research on the detention camps won the Pulitzer Prize, documented a system of abuse that the British government eventually acknowledged, paying compensation to surviving victims in 2013 after a legal case force the issue into the open. Lie number 52. The British always treated prisoners of war humanely. Britain has a long tradition of claiming. It observes the laws of war and treats prisoners with humanity. And there are genuine examples throughout British military history of prisoners being treated correctly. But the broader historical record is considerably more complicated. During the Second Boer War from 1899 to 1902, the British Army established concentration camps to hold Boer civilians, primarily women and children, removed from farms to prevent them supporting guerrilla fighters. The conditions were catastrophically bad. Roughly 28,000 Boer civilians died in the camps, the majority of them children, primarily from disease. Emily Hobhouse, a British welfare campaigner who visited the camps and reported on the conditions, was arrested and deported to prevent her findings from reaching the public. The broad claim that Britain has always upheld the laws of war in its treatment of prisoners does not survive detailed examination. Lie number 53. Empire Windrush arrivals were welcomed warmly by the British public. The arrival of the Empire Windrush at Tilbury Docks on the 22nd of June, 1948, carrying nearly 500 Caribbean migrants from Jamaica and other islands, has become a defining moment in the history of modern, multicultural Britain. But the experience of those who arrived on the Windrush and the hundreds of thousands who followed was not one of warm welcome. Many found signs on lodging houses saying no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. Discrimination in housing and employment was common and largely legal until the Race Relations Act of 1965. The Notting Hill race riots of 1958 were a brutal illustration of the tensions that existed. Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech in 1968 gave political voice to a strand of white British hostility that had been present throughout the post-war period. The Windrush generation built a new Britain against considerable resistance, and the recognition of that resistance is essential to understanding what they and their descendants actually achieved. Lie number 54. Robert Burns was a simple, uneducated ploughman poet. Robert Burns, Scotland's national poet, is often presented in popular culture as a rustic genius whose brilliance sprang spontaneously from nature rather than from learning. The image of the ploughman poet is certainly part of how Burns presented himself, and it served specific purposes in an age when simplicity and natural feeling were highly valued in literary culture. But Burns was not uneducated. He received a solid education in the Kirk school system and read widely throughout his life. His poetry drew on a deep knowledge of Scottish literary tradition, classical literature, English poetry, and the philosophical ideas of the Scottish Enlightenment. When Burns went to Edinburgh in 1786, after the success of the Kilmarnock edition, he moved in intellectual circles that included leading figures of the Scottish Enlightenment, and he held his own in that company with considerable ease. The ploughman poet image was partly a literary pose that played to what Edinburgh society wanted to see. Lie number 55. The Tolpuddle Martyrs were Britain's first trade unionists. The story of the 6 Dorset farm labourers sentenced to transportation to Australia in 1834 for forming a friendly society of agricultural labourers is a foundational story in British labour history, and they have come to represent the very origins of trade unionism in Britain. But the combination of workers for collective action long predates 1834. Trade combinations existed in Britain from at least the 18th century, and the Combination Acts of 1799 and 1800, which attempted to ban them, are evidence that they were already sufficiently threatening to require legislation. The Tolpuddle labourers were prosecuted not under any anti-union law, but under an old statute against illegal oaths. The case became famous partly because of the severity of the sentence, and partly because of the huge public campaign that eventually secured a pardon for the 6 men. They deserve their place in labour history, not as the founders of trade unionism, but as victims of a legal persecution whose story helped define and galvanise the early labour movement. Lie number 56. Child labour ended with the Factory Acts of the 1830s and 1840s. The Factory Acts of the 1830s and 1840s are often taught as the moment when child labour was brought under control in Britain, and they were genuinely significant pieces of legislation. But the full picture of child labour in Victorian Britain is considerably more complicated, and its persistence considerably longer, than a simple timeline of reforming legislation might suggest. The early Factory Acts applied only to certain industries. Domestic service, agriculture, coal mines, brickmaking, and countless other trades continued to employ very young children well into the second half of the 19th century. Children continued to work in chimney sweeping, the match industry, and numerous other trades with minimal regulation. Compulsory education, which the Elementary Education Act of 1870 began to establish, was arguably more significant in reducing child labour than any specific industrial legislation, because once children were required to be in school during the day, they could no longer be in factories. Lie number 57. The Suez Crisis showed that Britain was still a major world power. When Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal in July 1956, Prime Minister Anthony Eden made the fateful decision to coordinate a secret military operation with France and Israel to retake it. The operation succeeded militarily in its immediate objectives. But the United States, furious at not having been consulted, applied massive economic pressure on Britain through the pound sterling. This forced Britain to withdraw, and Eden resigned shortly afterward. The lesson many drew was the precise opposite of the one the exercise had been intended to demonstrate. Suez showed that Britain was no longer able to conduct major military operations without American approval. It demonstrated the limits of British power in stark and public terms. The humiliation was so complete that it accelerated decolonization and fundamentally reshaped British foreign policy toward much closer alignment with American priorities. Lie number 58. The Windrush scandal was a recent isolated incident. When the Windrush scandal emerged fully into public consciousness in 2018, with the revelation that British citizens who had come from Caribbean countries as children decades earlier were being wrongly detained, deported, or denied access to healthcare, it was presented in much of the media as a bureaucratic error. But the deeper historical and political context tells a different story. The Windrush generation were British citizens who had come to the country at the invitation of the British government. The destruction of the landing cards that could have documented their right to remain was not an accident, but a deliberate administrative decision. The hostile environment policies introduced from 2012 onward created a system in which people who had lived legally in Britain for 50 years were suddenly unable to prove their status. The scandal was not an isolated incident. It was the visible surface of a much deeper problem in how Britain has thought about race, belonging, and citizenship across the entire post-war period. Lie number 59. The Battle of Agincourt was won purely by the English longbow. The Battle of Agincourt, fought on the 25th of October 1415, is one of the most celebrated English military victories. An exhausted, heavily outnumbered English and Welsh army met a much larger French force and defeated it decisively. The longbow was certainly significant, and the massed archery that disrupted the advancing French knights was a crucial tactical element. But the outcome owed as much to French tactical errors as to English skill. The French chose to fight on a narrow front between two areas of woodland that compressed their numbers and prevented their superiority from telling. The heavy ground, softened by recent rain, slowed the advance of heavily armoured knights, while the lighter English and Welsh archers stood relatively firm. The victory at Agincourt was real and remarkable, but it was shaped by factors of ground, weather, and command decisions on both sides as much as by the celebrated English archers. Lie number 60. The English Civil War was simply a conflict between the king and Parliament. The English Civil War, more accurately, a series of civil wars between 1642 and 1651, is often reduced to a fairly simple conflict between the royalist supporters of King Charles I and the parliamentary forces led by Oliver Cromwell. But the wars were also shaped by a complex of religious, social, economic, and regional factors that cut across any simple divide. Scotland and Ireland were deeply involved in ways that transformed the conflict from an English affair into a British and Irish crisis. The Scottish Covenanters, with their own religious grievances, played a decisive role in weakening Charles before the English War began. Within England itself, the parliamentary side contained radical religious and social movements, including the Levellers and the Diggers, who had very different visions of what a new political settlement should look like from those held by the grandees of Parliament. The wars were complex, multi-layered, and often confused, and their outcomes were shaped by forces that a simple king versus Parliament framework cannot contain. Lie number 61. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 was a bloodless event. The Glorious Revolution of 1688, in which William of Orange was invited to invade England and James II fled to France rather than fight, is called glorious partly because it was achieved without significant fighting in England itself. The English settlement was indeed relatively smooth, and the constitutional changes it produced, including the Bill of Rights of 1689, were genuinely significant. But the revolution was not bloodless in any broader sense. In Ireland, James II did not accept his deposition and sparked a war that produced considerable devastation. The Siege of Derry, the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, and the subsequent Williamite Wars resulted in significant loss of life and enormous disruption to the Irish population. The penal laws imposed after the fighting stripped Irish Catholics of most civil and political rights for the following century. The massacre of Glencoe in 1692 also took place in the aftermath of the Revolution's political settlement. The bloodlessness is an English story. The broader British and Irish story was considerably more violent. Lie number 62. Clive of India was a hero of the British Empire. Robert Clive has been celebrated in certain British historical traditions as the founder of British India, the soldier-statesman who secured the subcontinent for British rule through his victory at the Battle of Plassey in 1757. But the historical record of what Clive actually did is far less comfortable. Plassey was not a straightforward military victory. Clive secured the outcome largely by bribing Mir Jafar, the commander of the Nawab of Bengal's army, to defect, ensuring the battle was effectively won before it began. In the aftermath, the plunder extracted from Bengal was extraordinary. Clive personally accepted enormous gifts from the new Nawab, wealth that was essentially a bribe for political support. He was later investigated by Parliament for his conduct in India and defended himself by saying he stood astonished at his own moderation. Parliament passed a resolution, finding that he had abused his power, but resolved to take no further action. Lie number 63. The Bristol slave trade was a minor historical footnote. Bristol's role in the transatlantic slave trade was not minor. Between 1698 and 1807, Bristol ships made over 2,000 voyages, transporting approximately 500,000 enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. For much of the 18th century, Bristol was the leading slave trading port in Britain. The wealth generated by the slave trade was woven deeply into the fabric of the city, funding its buildings, its institutions, and much of its subsequent economic development. The Colston family, whose name was attached to streets, schools, and public buildings for centuries, and whose statue was famously pulled down and thrown into the harbour during a Black Lives Matter protest in 2020, made much of their fortune through the slave trade. The reluctance to acknowledge this history, fully and honestly, was not unique to Bristol. Many British cities, ports, and country houses benefited from the wealth generated by enslaved labor, and the consequences of the slave trade are embedded in the national story in ways that go far beyond the merchant families most directly involved. Lie number 64. Jack the Ripper was never identified because Victorian police were helpless. The identity of Jack the Ripper, the name given to the unidentified killer who murdered at least 5 women in the Whitechapel area of London in the autumn of 1888, has never been established with certainty, and the case has generated an enormous industry of speculation. The popular framing often presents the investigation as a failure caused by the primitive state of Victorian forensics. But this is somewhat unfair to the officers who investigated the case. The murders took place in one of the most densely populated and desperately poor areas of London, where witnesses had strong reasons not to cooperate with police, and where social conditions made the tracking of individuals extremely difficult. The police actually gathered substantial information and conducted extensive interviews. What the case lacked was conclusive physical evidence, which even modern forensic science applied to 135-year-old materials has not yet definitively provided. The mystery endures not because no one looked, but because the evidence was simply insufficient to establish proof. Lie number 65. The suffragette movement was entirely peaceful and universally supported by women. The campaign for women's suffrage in Britain is a complex and genuinely remarkable story. The Pankhurst-led Women's Social and Political Union was not the only organisation campaigning for votes for women. The National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, led by Millicent Fawcett, had been working through peaceful constitutional means for decades and disapproved of the militant tactics the WWSPU adopted from 1905 onward. The militant campaign escalated significantly before the First World War, moving from window smashing to arson and bombing. Crucially, many women actively opposed female suffrage throughout the campaign, joining organisations like the National League for Opposing Woman Suffrage. The assumption that all women naturally wanted the vote and were united behind the suffrage campaign ignores a significant current of female opinion that, for various reasons, including genuine conservatism and class-based calculation, opposed it. Lie number 66. Bonnie Prince Charlie was beloved across all of Scotland. Charles Edward Stuart led the Jacobite Rising of 1745 with a romantic flair that has made him one of the most compelling figures in Scottish history. His campaign, raising an army that marched as far south as Derby before retreating, is genuinely dramatic. But the popular image of a Scotland united in its love for the Stuart cause is significantly overstated. The Rising of 1745 was primarily a Highland and Catholic campaign. Much of lowland Scotland, Protestant in religion and closely tied economically to the English connection, was not sympathetic and in some cases actively hostile. Scottish regiments fought on the government side at the Battle of Culloden in April 1746, and the defeat of the Rising was not a simple case of English suppression of Scottish nationalism. The transformation of the Jacobite Rising into a straightforwardly Scottish nationalist cause is partly a retrospective romanticism that began in the 19th century and owes more to Sir Walter Scott than to the complex political realities of 1745. Lie number 67. The Highland clearances were simply economic modernisation. The Highland clearances, the process by which tens of thousands of people were displaced from the Scottish Highlands, primarily in the late 18th and 19th centuries, are one of the most painful episodes in Scottish history. The clearances have sometimes been presented as an unfortunate but inevitable process of agricultural modernisation. But the experience of those cleared was often brutal and traumatic in ways that deserve to be named clearly. Families were forcibly evicted from homes they and their ancestors had occupied for generations, sometimes with little or no notice, sometimes with their houses burned to prevent return. The communities destroyed had deep cultural, linguistic, and social roots that were severed, contributing to the long decline of the Gaelic language and culture in Scotland. The clearances are now widely recognised as a historical injustice rather than simply an economic transition, and their legacy continues to shape debates about land ownership and rights in Scotland today. Lesson number 68. The Armistice of 1918 was a German military surrender. When the guns fell silent on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the general sense in the Allied countries was that Germany had been defeated and had surrendered. But the technical terms of the armistice and the military reality on the ground were more complicated than this framing suggests, and the ambiguity had very significant consequences. The armistice was not a military surrender in the formal sense. It was a ceasefire that ended the fighting while peace terms were negotiated. German armies were still on French and Belgian soil. They retreated in relatively good order, and many German soldiers and officers were able to tell themselves that the army had not been defeated in the field. This narrative, the stab in the back myth, became one of the most dangerous political myths of the 20th century, central to Adolf Hitler's political program and to the poisoning of the Weimar Republic's political culture. Number 69. World War II ended British racism at home. The victory over Nazi Germany was, among other things, a victory over an ideology of racial hierarchy, and the contrast between Allied values and Nazi race laws was a central element of how the war was understood in Britain. But the idea that this victory produced a transformation in British attitudes toward race at home requires very careful scrutiny. The same British army that fought against Nazi racial ideology was itself racially segregated in significant ways. The discrimination experienced by the Windrush generation in the post-war decades was real and systematic. Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech found a substantial audience precisely because the hostility to non-white immigration that it expressed was genuinely present in significant sections of white British society. The Race Relations Acts of 1965 and 1968 were necessary precisely because discrimination in housing and employment was legal, common, and defended. The idea that defeating Nazism somehow resolved the racism embedded in British society is a comfortable illusion that does not survive contact with the lived experience of those who encountered that racism in the decades after 1945. Lie number 70. Winston Churchill wanted Indian independence. Churchill's views on India are not a mystery. He expressed them clearly and often throughout his political career. He opposed Indian independence with genuine conviction, and his attitude toward Indian self-government was consistently and explicitly hostile. During the Second World War, he refused to take seriously the August 1942 Quit India resolution and had Gandhi and the Congress leadership imprisoned. His handling of the Bengal famine of 1943, in which somewhere between 2 and 3 million people died while food continued to be exported and emergency relief was delayed, has been the subject of significant historical debate. Leo Amery, his own Secretary of State for India, privately wrote that he did not see much difference between Churchill's attitude on India and Hitler's. The post-war rehabilitation of Churchill as a champion of democracy has tended to set aside the substantial portion of his political career spent in passionate opposition to the democratic aspirations of the largest population in the British Empire. Lie number 71. Britain invented the concentration camp. The claim that Britain invented the concentration camp is sometimes made in discussions of the Boer War, and it requires some historical precision. The term concentration camp was used to describe the camps established by the British military in South Africa during the Second Boer War, in which Boer civilians, primarily women and children, were held after their farms were destroyed as part of a scorched earth policy. The conditions were catastrophic, and tens of thousands of people died. Spain had used something similar in Cuba in the 1890s, and the United States used similar policies in the Philippines around the same period. What is unambiguous is that the British concentration camps were real, that the suffering in them was terrible and largely preventable, and that the public exposure of conditions by Emily Hobhouse resulted in significant improvements that reduced the mortality rate substantially in the final year of the war. Lie number 72. The Good Friday Agreement permanently ended all conflict in Northern Ireland. The Good Friday Agreement of April 1998 was a remarkable political achievement that brought an end to the Troubles, the period of armed conflict in Northern Ireland that had claimed over 3,500 lives since the late 1960s. The ceasefire and the peace that followed represented a genuine and profound change in the lives of people across Northern Ireland, an island, but calling it a permanent resolution requires some qualification. Dissident Republican groups rejected the agreement and continued to carry out attacks in the years following 1998. The political institutions created by the agreement have at various points collapsed, most notably in 2002 and again in 2022. With the Northern Ireland Assembly suspended for years at a time, Brexit and the subsequent controversies over the Northern Ireland Protocol and the Windsor Framework reactivated many underlying tensions. The Good Friday Agreement was a beginning, and a genuinely important one, but the work of building durable peace in Northern Ireland continues to be necessary and to remain incomplete. Lie number 73. The Great Exhibition of 1851 represented the whole empire equally. The Great Exhibition of 1851, held in the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park, was one of the defining events of the Victorian era and a spectacular display of industrial confidence and imperial ambition. It drew millions of visitors and presented the British Empire as a benevolent and civilizing force, gathering the wealth and ingenuity of the world under one roof. But who was represented and how tells a more complicated story. The contributions of colonized peoples were typically displayed as raw materials, exotic curiosities, or specimens of primitive craftsmanship, framed in contrast to the industrial manufacturing power of Britain. The people of India, Africa, and other colonized territories were not participants as equals. They were, in important ways, themselves exhibits, demonstrating the variety and richness of the empire Britain had accumulated. The exhibition reflected the values of a system that extracted raw materials from colonies and processed them into manufactured goods in British factories, presenting this arrangement as universal human progress. Lie number 74. The Tower of London's primary purpose was as a prison. The Tower of London is one of the most visited historical sites in Britain, and its popular reputation is overwhelmingly that of a place of imprisonment, torture, and execution. The association with imprisonment is real. Significant numbers of high-status prisoners were held there over the centuries, and executions were part of its history. But the tower was primarily built and used for very different purposes. William the Conqueror began it as a royal fortress and symbol of Norman power. For centuries it served as a royal palace, one of the principal residences of the medieval English monarchy. It was also the site of the Royal Mint from the 13th century until 1810. The Office of Ordnance managed the weapons of the realm there. The royal menagerie containing exotic animals was housed there for over 600 years. The crown jewels have been stored there since at least the 13th century. The tower was a multifunctional royal fortress and centre of government, and its identity, as primarily a grim prison, is partly a product of the dramatic stories that have clustered around it over time. Lie number 75. The Magna Carta has always been considered a great founding document. There is a curious historical fact about the Magna Carta's reputation that is often overlooked. In the immediate aftermath of 1215, Magna Carta was annulled by Pope Innocent III within weeks, declared null and void as a shameful and unjust agreement by the papal authority that King John had been courting. For much of the medieval period, it was invoked primarily in very specific legal and political contexts, rather than being celebrated as a universal statement of rights. The great elevation of Magna Carta to the status of a foundational constitutional document began most seriously in the 17th century, when lawyers and parliamentarians opposing the Stuart kings found in it a powerful historical argument for the ancient rights of Englishmen. Edward Coke was particularly important in constructing the interpretation of Magna Carta as a proto-constitutional document. The status Magna Carta now enjoys is largely a 17th century invention built on top of a 13th century political instrument, and the gap between the two is wider than most celebratory accounts acknowledge. Lie number 76. England and Britain are the same thing. The conflation of England with Britain, and of both with the United Kingdom, is so widespread that it is almost reflexive for many speakers, including many English people themselves. It is common to hear people say Britain when they mean England, and England when they mean the United Kingdom, with a casualness that can be genuinely irritating to Scottish, Welsh, and Northern Irish people, for whom the distinction is not merely pedantic, but carries real meaning. Britain, or Great Britain, refers to the island containing England, Scotland, and Wales. The United Kingdom includes Northern Ireland as well. Each of these unions had its own particular history of resistance and acceptance. Scotland has its own legal system, its own education system, its own church, and its own parliament, established in 1999. Wales has its own parliament and its own language. The tendency to use England when Britain is meant is not merely imprecise. For many people across the British Isles, it erases a significant part of their identity and history. Lie number 77. The British invented democracy. The claim that Britain invented democracy, or that the Westminster Parliament is the mother of parliaments, appears frequently in British political rhetoric. The Athenian democracy of the 5th century BC, which allowed citizens to vote directly on legislation and public questions, preceded the English Parliament by nearly 2,000 years. What the English and later British Parliament actually developed was a specific form of representative government, evolving over centuries from medieval councils toward the gradually expanding franchise of the 19th and 20th centuries. Women did not have full equal voting rights in Britain until 1928. The forms of representative government that have spread around the world draw on many sources, including ancient Greek ideas, Roman law, the Italian city-states of the Renaissance, and the democratic experiments of the American and French revolutions, as well as the British parliamentary tradition. The Westminster model has been one influence among several, not the singular origin of democratic governance. Lie number 78. The Industrial Revolution was a triumph for ordinary working people. The Industrial Revolution, which transformed Britain from an agricultural to an industrial economy from roughly the 1760s to the 1840s, is sometimes presented as a straightforwardly progressive story of technological innovation and economic growth. But the experience of the working people, whose labour made it possible, was in many cases one of deteriorating conditions, displacement, and exploitation rather than triumph. The enclosure of common land drove many rural people off the land they had worked. Factory work was often brutally long and dangerous, with men, women, and young children working 12 to 16 hours a day in conditions of considerable physical risk. Handloom weavers and other skilled artisans whose trades were made obsolete by machinery faced economic catastrophe. The overcrowded industrial cities had appalling sanitation, housing, and public health, producing urban mortality rates often higher than rural ones. None of this cancels the genuine importance of the economic transformation, but it belongs in the story as fully as the technological achievements. Lie number 79. Shakespeare was a solitary literary genius who owed nothing to collaboration. The Shakespearean legend is powerful, and the works attributed to him are extraordinary. But the picture of a solitary genius producing masterpieces in isolation does not reflect how the Elizabethan and Jacobean theatre actually worked. Shakespeare was a working dramatist embedded in a collaborative professional world. He was a shareholder in the Globe Theatre, a working member of an acting company, and his plays were written to be performed by specific actors whose strengths shaped the parts he created. There is considerable scholarly evidence that he collaborated on a number of his plays. Henry VI. Part 1 is now generally thought to have been written, partly with other playwrights. Timon of Athens appears to have been co-written with Thomas Middleton. The Two Noble Kinsmen was written with John Fletcher. The idea that every word in the Shakespeare canon was written by a single isolated genius is a product of the romantic cult of authorship that emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries. This does not diminish what Shakespeare achieved, it makes it more interesting. Lie number 80. The British class system has always been as it is today. The British class system is often discussed as though it were an ancient and unchanging feature of English life, a permanent hierarchy that has shaped the country in the same way through the centuries. But the class system has changed significantly over time, sometimes more rapidly than anyone expected, and its current form is a relatively modern creation. The medieval social order was structured around feudal ranks and obligations quite different from modern class distinctions. The rise of a commercial and professional middle class during the 18th and 19th centuries transformed social relations considerably. The 20th century saw enormous changes, with the decline of the old landed aristocracy as a dominant force, the massive expansion of the middle class, and the partial erosion of working class identity through deindustrialization. The persistence of considerable inequality of opportunity and the continued overrepresentation of privately educated people in positions of power are real, but they take forms that would have been unrecognizable to people living under the social structures of 200 or 500 years ago. Lie number 81. The English language has always been essentially as it is today. When people talk about defending the English language, they are usually imagining a relatively stable entity that has been essentially constant and now faces various threats. But the English language has changed so dramatically over time that a modern English speaker transported to England in 1300 would be almost entirely unable to understand the language being spoken around them. Middle English, the language of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, requires specialist study for modern readers. Old English, the language of Beowulf, is essentially a foreign language. English has also always been a language that borrows freely and extensively from other languages, absorbing massive quantities of Latin and French vocabulary after the Norman conquest. Words from Dutch during the age of sea trade, from Hindi, Urdu, Arabic, and many other languages during the imperial period, and from American English throughout the 20th century. The anxiety about the corruption of English by new influences is not new. Swift and Johnson complained about it in previous centuries, and in each generation, the language changed anyway, as it always has, growing richer and more complex in the process. Lie number 82. The British railway system was a pure triumph of private enterprise. The Victorian railway network, built at extraordinary speed from the 1830s onward, is often cited as a demonstration of what private enterprise can achieve free from government interference. But the story of private railway development was not a clean narrative of efficient markets producing optimal outcomes. The railway mania of the 1840s, when speculative investment in railway shares reached extraordinary heights, destroyed the savings of many ordinary investors when the bubble burst. The proliferation of competing railway companies produced considerable duplication and waste, including multiple lines running parallel routes between the same cities. Parliamentary oversight throughout the Victorian period included growing regulation of fares and safety standards, acknowledging that unregulated private railways were not serving the public interest adequately. When the private railway companies were nationalised in 1948, many had been running at a loss for years. The subsequent privatisation of the railways in 1994 has continued to generate debate about whether private provision actually produces better outcomes for passengers. Lie number 83. The Reformation in England was primarily about theology. When Henry VIII broke with Rome in the 1530s, the immediate theological question was relatively narrow. The king wanted an annulment the Pope would not grant. The theological content of the early English Reformation was deliberately conservative. Henry had no interest in Protestantism as a doctrinal system and executed Protestants alongside Catholics throughout his reign. But the Reformation was also always about money. The dissolution of the monasteries between 1536 and 1541 transferred an enormous amount of land and wealth from the church to the crown and from the crown to a new class of landowners who had purchased former monastic lands. Those new landowners had a direct material interest in the Protestant settlement remaining in place, because a Catholic restoration would threaten their property. The Reformation thus created its own social basis for survival, independent of anyone's theological convictions, tying the interest of significant sections of the English elite to the survival of the Protestant settlement, regardless of what any individual believed about doctrine. Lie number 84. India's railways were a gift of British imperial progress. The railways built across India under British rule are frequently cited as one of the great benevolent legacies of empire. The railways were real, and they were extensive, eventually becoming one of the largest rail networks in the world. But they were financed largely by Indian taxpayers rather than by British investment. The guaranteed interest on railway bonds was paid by the Indian government, meaning Indian revenue covered the profits returned to British investors, whether the railways made money or not. The railways were built primarily to serve British economic and military interests, moving raw materials to the ports for export and enabling the rapid deployment of troops to suppress rebellion. The engineering and management positions were almost entirely reserved for British employees, whose salaries were paid at British rates from Indian revenues. Economists studying the long-term effects have estimated that the net flow of wealth from India to Britain via the railway system was enormous. The railways were not a gift. They were an instrument of extraction that Indians paid for themselves and that served their colonizers first. Lie number 85. The British press has always been a fearless defender of truth and freedom. The British press has a genuine tradition of investigative journalism, of speaking truth to power, and of exposing wrongdoing. But it has also throughout its history functioned as a vehicle for propaganda, political manipulation, and the defense of established power. The press lords of the early 20th century wielded their newspapers as instruments of direct political power, supporting or attacking politicians according to their own interests. Stanley Baldwin's famous description of the press barons seeking power without responsibility captured something real about how newspaper ownership has functioned in British political life. The tabloid press of the late 20th and early 21st centuries produced a culture of phone hacking, fabrication, and sustained campaigns of personal destruction, which came to light most publicly in the Leveson inquiry that began in 2011. British media has also for long periods consistently underrepresented the perspectives and concerns of the working class, of ethnic minorities, and of women. The tradition of a free press is genuinely important and worth defending, but it should not be confused with the tradition of impartial truth-telling. Lie number 86. The Stone of Destiny is the same stone on which Scottish kings were crowned. The Stone of Destiny taken from Scotland by Edward I of England in 1296, was incorporated into the coronation chair at Westminster Abbey, where English and later British monarchs sat upon it during their coronation ceremonies for centuries. It was returned to Scotland in 1996 and is now kept in Edinburgh Castle, though it is still brought to Westminster for coronations. But a persistent Scottish tradition holds that the monks of Scone, forewarned of Edward's approach, substituted a plain block of sandstone for the real stone and hid the genuine article. The stone that Edward carried off to England, according to this tradition, was a decoy. Whether this story is true is impossible to establish with certainty. What is interesting is that it has been told and retold with evident satisfaction in Scotland for centuries. A small and enduring act of resistance in which the greatest prize of English conquest turns out to have been worthless all along. The historical truth may be unknowable, but the cultural life of the story tells its own tale about memory and identity. Lie number 87. Nelson Mandela was always recognized as a heroic figure by the British government. Nelson Mandela is today one of the most universally admired political figures of the 20th century, and in Britain his image adorns public spaces, his name given to parks and squares. But the British government's attitude toward Mandela and the African National Congress during the years of apartheid was considerably less admiring. Margaret Thatcher's government consistently opposed international sanctions against South Africa, arguing that sanctions would harm the black South African population. In 1987, a Conservative Party youth group produced a poster calling on people to hang Nelson Mandela, an image that embarrassed the party but reflected a real strand of opinion. Thatcher described the ANC as a typical terrorist organization in 1987, expressing a position consistent with her government's broader stance. The ANC remained on American terrorist watch lists until 2008. The process by which Mandela became a universally celebrated symbol of justice took decades and required a fundamental reassessment of which side of history those governments had been on. Lie number 88. The English longbow was an English invention. The longbow occupies a special place in English military mythology, associated with the yeoman archer and the great victories of Crécy and Agincourt. But the powerful self-bow had been used across northern Europe for thousands of years before medieval English armies adopted it. More significantly, the specific development of the war bow as an effective military weapon in the British Isles is most strongly associated not with England, but with Wales. Welsh archers, particularly from Gwent and the Forest of Dean, were using the longbow to devastating effect well before English armies adopted it on the same scale. The Welsh Wars of Edward I in the late 13th century gave English commanders direct experience of what skilled Welsh archers could do, and it was partly from Welsh military practice that the English learned the tactical use of massed archery that would characterize their armies in the 100 Years' War. Welsh archers served in English armies throughout the medieval period, and their contribution to the victories, celebrated as English triumphs, was fundamental. Lie number 89. The Domesday Book was a straightforward census. The Domesday Book, compiled on the orders of William the Conqueror in 1086, is one of the most extraordinary administrative documents produced in medieval Europe. It surveyed the landholdings of England in such detail that nothing comparable was attempted again for centuries. But calling it a census is not quite accurate. It was not designed to count the population. Its primary purpose was fiscal and political. William needed to know who held land in England, what that land was worth, and what obligations its holders owed to the Crown. The result was a comprehensive snapshot of landholding and taxable value rather than a population record. Ordinary peasants, women, and the many categories of unfree agricultural workers appear in its pages largely as units of agricultural production attached to particular estates, rather than as individuals with their own histories. The book tells us an enormous amount about the structure of Norman England, but it was designed to serve the tax and governance needs of a conqueror, rather than to document the lives of the people living under him. Lie number 90. Britain has always been a Christian country. The description of Britain as a Christian country implies a continuity of religious identity stretching back to antiquity. But the history of religion in Britain is considerably more layered than this framing suggests. Before the Roman occupation, the inhabitants of Britain practiced forms of Celtic polytheism. Roman Britain was religiously diverse, with the official Roman pantheon coexisting with mystery religions, Mithraism, and eventually Christianity. The Anglo-Saxon migrations brought peoples with their own religious traditions, and the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons was a process that took generations. Viking settlement brought Norse religious culture. The medieval period was one of intense Christian faith, but also of complex local practices that blended Christian observance with older traditions. The Protestant Reformation fractured Christian unity in ways whose consequences lasted for centuries. And in modern Britain, significant non-Christian communities, Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, Jewish, Buddhist, and many others, are a long-established part of the country's religious landscape. Britain has a Christian history, but it has never been only Christian. Lie number 91. The penny black made communication immediately affordable for everyone. The penny black, issued on the 6th of May, 1840, was genuinely the world's first adhesive postage stamp, and its introduction as part of Rowland Hill's postal reform was a real innovation. Before 1840, postage was paid by the recipient rather than the sender, and the rates were complex and often expensive. Hill's reform simplified the system, introduced a uniform penny rate regardless of distance within Britain, and required prepayment by the sender. The improvement in accessibility was real, and the volume of mail sent in Britain increased substantially in the years following the reform. But immediate democratization was not quite as complete as the story sometimes implies. A penny in 1840 was not a negligible sum for the working class. A labouring man earning 10 shillings a week would think carefully before spending a penny on a letter, particularly when many families were illiterate. The expansion of cheap postal communication was a gradual process that depended on rising literacy rates and rising wages over the following decades. Lie number 92. The Great Reform Act of 1832 gave ordinary people the vote. The Great Reform Act of 1832 is one of those historical events whose title does a good deal of advance work on its own behalf. The act was genuinely significant. It abolished the rotten boroughs, redistributed parliamentary seats to the new industrial cities of the North and Midlands, and extended the franchise to some new categories of property owners. But the electorate after the Reform Act was still a very small fraction of the adult population. The Act enfranchised property owners above a certain threshold, and the majority of working-class men remained without the vote. Women of any class remained entirely excluded. The Chartist movement that emerged almost immediately afterward, demanding universal male suffrage, was a direct response to the sense that the Act had changed the composition of the governing class, without genuinely widening political power to ordinary people. Full universal adult suffrage was not achieved in Britain until 1928, when women were finally given the vote on equal terms with men. Lie number 93. The Union Jack has always looked the same. The Union Jack is so familiar that it is easy to assume it has always existed in its current form. But the flag has evolved over time, reflecting the changing political geography of the British Isles. The earliest version of the flag, combining the crosses of St. George for England and St. Andrew for Scotland, was introduced in 1606 following the accession of James VI of Scotland to the English throne. Wales was not separately represented, having been legally incorporated into England by the Acts of Union in the 1530s. It was only with the Act of Union of 1800, which brought Ireland into the United Kingdom, that the cross of St. Patrick was added, creating the current three-cross design. Wales has never had a separate heraldic cross incorporated into the Union Jack, a fact that has been a minor source of complaint from Welsh nationalists for centuries. The flag, as we know it today, has existed for just over 200 years, which is considerably shorter than the impression of ancient permanence it conveys. Lie number 94. The Black Prince embodied the ideals of medieval chivalry perfectly. Edward of Woodstock, Prince of Wales, known as the Black Prince, is one of the most celebrated figures of medieval English military history. His victories at Crécy in 1346 and at Poitiers in 1356, where he captured the French king, John II, made him one of the most famous knights in Europe during his lifetime. The image of the Black Prince as a paragon of chivalry and noble conduct has endured for centuries. But the historical record also includes the sack of Limoges in 1370, which tells a different and more troubling story. After the city of Limoges transferred its allegiance to the French crown, the Black Prince's forces carried out a massacre of the civilian population, recorded by the chronicler Jean Froissart as killing more than 3,000 men, women, and children. The sack was not an anomaly in the conduct of a medieval warfare, but it complicates the chivalric image considerably, suggesting that the celebrated code of knightly behavior applied primarily to the treatment of noble adversaries rather than to civilian populations caught between competing armies. Lie number 95. Samuel Pepys was simply a diarist who happened to witness interesting events. Samuel Pepys, whose detailed diary covering the years 1660 to 1669 is one of the most intimate and compelling personal documents in the English language, is often treated primarily as a lucky bystander who witnessed the Great Fire of London, the Plague Year of 1665, and the restoration of the monarchy. But reducing Pepys to his role as a diarist does considerable injustice to his significance as a public figure and administrator. Pepys was one of the most important naval administrators in British history. As Clerk of the Acts and later Secretary to the Admiralty, he transformed the administrative capacity of the Royal Navy at a time when naval power was becoming central to British commercial and military ambition. He introduced systematic record-keeping, procurement reform, and professional standards to an organisation previously marked by patronage and inefficiency. He was also a Fellow of the Royal Society and served as its president. The diary, for all its extraordinary quality, is only one part of the legacy of a man who was also a serious and consequential public servant. Lie number 96. The British won the Falklands War because of superior military skill alone. The Falklands War of 1982, in which British forces retook the Falkland Islands after Argentina's military junta invaded in April of that year, was a genuine military achievement conducted at considerable distance from Britain and under real logistical constraints. The task force assembled with remarkable speed, and the battles at Goose Green, Mount Longdon, and Tumbledown were real demonstrations of military competence and individual courage. But the outcome was significantly shaped by factors beyond military skill alone. American intelligence and logistical support was crucial, with the United States providing satellite intelligence and diplomatic assistance that significantly aided the British operation. The Argentine Air Force came closer than is often acknowledged to defeating the task force. Sinking several British ships, and might have done considerably more damage, had a significant proportion of its bombs not failed to explode due to being dropped from too low an altitude. The war was won by genuine courage and professional competence, but accompanied by Argentine errors, American assistance, and a degree of fortune that the triumphant retrospective accounts have not always adequately acknowledged. Lie number 97. Britain's colonial legacy has no relevance to the present day. The argument that colonial history is simply history, over and done with, and that focusing on it is a kind of wallowing in the past, appears regularly in British public debate. But the claim that the past has no relevance to the present is itself an empirical claim that can be tested. The economic structures of many former colonies were shaped by British rule in ways that created lasting disadvantages. The extraction of wealth, the suppression of local industry, and the arbitrary drawing of borders that grouped incompatible communities together all had consequences that did not disappear on Independence Day. The communities in Britain that descended from citizens of former colonies have experienced structural inequalities in employment, housing, health, education, and the criminal justice system that trace traceable lines back to the history of how those communities came to be in Britain and how they were received when they arrived. Acknowledging those causes is not the same as claiming that nothing can change or that contemporary individuals bear personal guilt. It is simply the requirement of honest analysis. Lie number 98. Jack the Ripper's victims are less important than the mystery of his identity. The 5 women murdered in the Whitechapel area of London in the autumn of 1888, the women whose deaths gave rise to the name Jack the Ripper, have for over a century been discussed primarily as context for a mystery about an unidentified killer. Their names, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, are sometimes absent from accounts that spend thousands of words speculating about a murderer who was never identified. These were real women with real lives, families, hopes, and histories, who were killed in conditions of extreme poverty and vulnerability in one of the most deprived areas of Victorian London. The enormous cultural industry that has grown around the Ripper case, the tours, the books, the films, the documentaries, has tended to transform their deaths into a puzzle to be solved or a story to be sensationalized rather than a tragedy to be mourned. The way these women have been remembered, or more often not remembered, reflects something uncomfortable about whose lives a society considers worth examining carefully and whose are treated merely as the backdrop for someone else's drama. Tarikin, lie number 99. History is a collection of settled facts that experts agree upon. If this long and quiet journey through 98 contested stories has demonstrated anything, it may be this. History is not a fixed archive of established truths waiting to be memorized. It is a living discipline in which evidence is gathered, interpreted, challenged, and revised by generations of scholars, working across time, language, and culture. Almost every story in this conversation has been the subject of genuine historical debate, and the version offered here is not a final verdict, but a summary of where the weight of current scholarship appears to point, with the understanding that future researchers may find new evidence that requires further revision. For centuries, the history of Britain was written primarily by and for the educated, the wealthy, the male, and the English-speaking. The gradual broadening of the historical discipline to include the perspectives of women, the working class, the colonized, the enslaved, and the communities previously rendered invisible is ongoing work. And that work matters, not because it gives us a better set of facts to memorize, but because it gives us a more honest, more complete, and an ultimately more useful understanding of how the world we inhabit came to be shaped as it is. That understanding, held with curiosity and humility rather than certainty and closure, is what history at its best can offer. And so we arrive, very gently, at the end of our long journey through the quiet rooms of British history. 99 stories, 99 moments where the comfortable version of events turns out to be a little more complicated, a little more human, and a great deal more interesting than the one we were first given. History is not a fixed set of facts to be memorized and repeated. It is a conversation between the living and the dead, between the questions we ask today and the fragmentary answers the past has left behind. The stories we have visited tonight do not diminish the genuine achievements, the real courage or the authentic moments of grace that are also part of this long and complicated history. They simply ask that we hold all of it together, the beautiful and the difficult, the celebrated and the overlooked, with the kind of honest and generous attention that every human story deserves. Rest now. The questions will still be there in the morning, patient and interesting as ever, waiting for your curious, well-rested mind.